The day my father was buried, my brother handed out checks. He stood at the front of that reception hall like a man who had already won, like the outcome was settled and all anyone needed to do was show up and collect. 52 people in that room. Family, old friends, neighbors who had known our father for 30, some of them 40 years. And there was Gerald, moving row to row with the easy confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment so many times it had become something he believed was real. He moved through that grief-soaked room like it was a transaction, pressing folded checks into palms, leaning in, smiling the smile of a man who thinks he has just won something. I watched him for a long time before I stood up. When I did, I reached under my chair and picked up the canvas bag I had carried in that morning. It was not heavy, but I had been thinking about what was inside it for months. I stood and walked to the first row and placed a sealed envelope on the lap of my Aunt Rosie, who was 81 years old and had driven in from 2 counties away. She looked up at me with the quietly bewildered expression of a woman who has lived long enough to know that things are rarely as simple as they appear. Then I kept walking. 1 envelope per person. By the time I reached the 3rd row, the room had gone quiet in a way I had never felt in any room before. Not the quiet of grief, which I knew well by then. Something different, the quiet of 52 people who suddenly understood, without fully understanding why, that they were watching 2 entirely different stories about the same man collide in real time, and only one of them was going to be left standing. My brother looked at me from across the room, and his face did something I had never seen it do. He looked afraid. Not surprised, which I might have expected. Not angry, which I had prepared for. Afraid. And in that moment I understood that some part of Gerald had always known this day might come. He had simply wagered that it would not. He lost that wager. I want to tell you what was in those envelopes. I want to tell you what happened when 52 people opened them and read what was inside. I want to tell you about Gerald's face when he read his own. But I have to go back first, because the ending only makes sense if you understand who my father was and who Gerald was before everything fell apart, and what I found in the bottom drawer of a workbench on a dark evening in early winter. My father's name was Raymond Harold Elias, Ray to everyone who loved him, which was nearly everyone who spent more than an afternoon in his company. He was 78 years old when he died on a Tuesday morning in early spring. He had spent 41 of those years running a small machine shop on the western edge of our county, in a low building the size of a large garage with a gravel lot out front and a hand-painted sign that had faded so gradually over the decades that by the time I was grown, none of us could remember what color it had originally been. The shop was not famous outside the county. But if you needed something machined to a tolerance that mattered, a part no catalog carried, a man who could look at a broken thing and understand what it had once been, you went to Ray Elias. He had a reputation built entirely on the kind of work that makes other craftsmen stop and study. He was not a man who talked much about what he felt. He showed you instead, with his time, his presence, those calloused hands that could hold a micrometer as delicately as a librarian holds a first edition. When my daughter was born, he drove 4 hours in a snowstorm without anyone asking him to, sat in the waiting room for 6 hours without complaint, and when they finally let him in, he held that baby for a long time, and then looked up at me and said only, "She has good hands." She is 23 now, and she has her great-grandfather's hands almost exactly. That is the best inheritance I know of. My mother died of a fast cancer when Gerald was 15 and I was 19. It was one of those losses that changes the shape of a family permanently, realigns the way everyone understands their own role. My father held us together without talking about holding us together. He worked the early shift, he came home, he made dinner. He helped Gerald with his homework at the kitchen table while I did the dishes, and then he did the dishes while I finished whatever I was working on. He did not complain. He did not hold grief against the world. He simply kept moving, which is the only real thing left to do when the person at the center of your life is suddenly gone. Gerald was 4 years younger than me, and I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about a brother who was always rotten. He was not. Gerald was funny, genuinely, warmly funny, the kind of person who could find the likeness in a hard moment and offer it to you without it feeling false. He was the one who made our father laugh in those first raw years after our mother died. He was the one who could walk into a family dinner already crackling with old tension and somehow, simply by being there, ease it. I have not forgotten that. I will not pretend it away. What happened later does not erase what was real. But Gerald was also the one who learned early that charm was a form of currency, and over time he spent it on things that were not worth what he paid. He borrowed his way through his 20s. He made promises he believed at the moment he made them and found ways to be elsewhere when they came due. He was not malicious, not at first. He was simply someone who had never been asked to stay and be uncomfortable. And a person who is never asked to stay learns, without realizing it, that leaving is always an option. He moved to another state by his mid-20s. He called on holidays. He visited at Christmas, sometimes at Easter. He sent birthday cards that arrived a few days late. No one said anything about the imbalance out loud. Families absorb these things in silence. For 2 decades I lived 40 minutes from my father. I drove over most Sunday mornings. I helped with his taxes, sat across from his doctor after each health scare taking notes, drove him to appointments when his eyesight made the highway worrying. When his shoulder gave out, I mowed the back field. When his furnace failed in January, I was there that same night. I was not heroic about it. I simply showed up, which is most of what love actually is. My father never asked me to do any of it. He never made Gerald feel guilty for not doing it. He received what I offered without making a ceremony of it, which was the right thing to do, and which I understood even then was a form of respect. But here is what I need you to understand about my father. He was quiet and modest, and he had a deep faith in the goodness of the people he loved. He was not naive. He had spent a lifetime reading the tolerances of materials, understanding where stress concentrates, knowing which parts hold and which fail. He applied that same precise attention to the people around him, and he knew things about his sons that he kept to himself. Until once. He said them to me in a hospital room, 7 weeks before he died. I will tell you what he said, but not yet. First, you need to know what Gerald did. And that story has 3 parts. The first time I found out something was wrong, I was at my kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Among the usual mail there was a statement from a rural lending institution I had never heard of. My name was on it because my name had been on the farm deed for 15 years, added by my father in his quiet, methodical way of ensuring clean transfer. What the statement described was a refinancing. The terms were not favorable. The numbers were significant. My signature appeared on the loan documents. I had not signed anything. When I confronted Gerald, he had an answer. He always had an answer, quick and plausible, the kind that sounds reasonable if you are not paying close attention. He said Dad had asked him to handle some cash flow concerns with the shop, that my name had appeared as a formality, that it was all perfectly legitimate, and he had not wanted to worry me with the paperwork details. I called my father that afternoon. He was quiet for a moment, then said he would take care of it, that Gerald had gotten ahead of himself, that I should not worry. I let it go. I told myself families have complications, and my father was an old man who did not need his sons in open conflict over paperwork. That was my first mistake. 8 months later, a man named Carl Briggs called me on a Thursday evening. Carl had worked for my father for 11 years, a quiet and precise machinist who had learned the trade the way my father had, slowly, with his hands. Carl said he was not sure if he was overstepping. He said he thought I should know. He said some equipment had passed through a dealer 2 towns over that week that he recognized. My father's tools. Not all of them. The newer ones were still in the shop, but the older ones, the ones my father had described to me when I was 12 as if each were a word in a language worth learning, were gone. Sold while my father was in a rehabilitation facility recovering from a fall. 6 weeks away from his shop. Gerald had used a key he said Dad had given him. Carl had let him in because Gerald was family and Carl had no reason not to. Then Gerald took what was there and sold it. I drove to the facility that weekend. My father was thinner than I had seen him, tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. We talked about small things before I said anything. Then I told him what Carl had told me. He closed his eyes. Stayed that way for almost a full minute. Then he said, he asked for his wrench last week. The old one. The first one I ever bought for myself when I was 22. Cost me a week's wages. I've had it for 56 years. He asked for it, and the aide said she didn't know where it was. The aide didn't know because it was already gone. I looked at my father's face in that moment and saw something I still have no clean word for. Not anger. Not grief exactly. Something older than either. The expression of a man who has suspected something for a long time and has now had it confirmed in the quietest and most irreversible way. The expression of someone who has just had his last small hope that he was wrong simply removed, without ceremony, without even the dignity of a confrontation. "Stay calm," he said to me. "Whatever you are feeling right now, I need you to stay calm." Then he told me there was something in the workshop. Bottom drawer of the workbench, left side, under the spare sandpaper. An envelope. He said it had been there for some time. He said I should read what was inside, and then I should call a man named Fletcher. He gave me the number from memory. I drove back to the farm that evening, found the envelope, read what was inside. Then I stood in the gravel lot of my father's shop for 20 minutes while it got dark, reading it again in the last light, understanding what my father had done and when he had done it and why. Then I called Fletcher. The third part of the story happened while my father was dying. Gerald came to the hospital twice in the last 3 weeks, each time with a younger attorney carrying a leather portfolio. They would spend time alone with my father, then leave. He never mentioned these visits unless I asked. When I did, he said only that Gerald was concerned about the estate and wanted things clarified. He said he had not signed anything. He had not. What he had done instead was stall. He had asked for time. He had said he needed to think. He had been polite and warm and utterly unmovable, the way a man is when he has already made his decision and simply needs the clock to run out. Because 10 years before, my father had made certain that nothing Gerald was trying to do could legally succeed. Fletcher was a real estate attorney who had grown up in the same county as my father and known him since they were young men. My father had come to his office one morning a decade earlier, sat down, and said, "I need to do something quietly. I need it done right. I need it to last." What he had filed was a second deed, not a replacement, an addendum, a legal instrument clarifying in precise and binding language the conditions under which any asset connected to the property or the shop could be transferred, sold, mortgaged, or altered. Filed with the county recorder. Witnessed by a notary. Signed, dated, recorded, entirely unknown to Gerald. The refinancing had been conducted in explicit violation of that deed. The signature on the loan documents was, as a handwriting analyst confirmed at Fletcher's request months before my father died, a forgery. Not a misunderstanding. A forgery. The tools Gerald had sold were itemized in the deed as protected assets, non-transferable without both signatures, mine and my father's. Neither had been obtained. The sale was legally void. And the will Gerald had twice tried to get signed in that hospital room? The clock had run out. My father had understood his own timeline and had calculated accordingly with the same precision he applied to everything he ever built. I want to pause here, because I think this is the moment that changes everything. Not the legal discovery, though that mattered. What changes here is understanding the full length of my father's patience. He had known. He had known for years. And he had not raged. He had not confronted. He had not cut Gerald off or altered his manner or given any sign that he saw what was happening. He had simply kept going about his days, kept welcoming his son when his son came, kept answering the phone when it rang, while quietly, on his own schedule, in his own time, he built something that would outlast all of it. That is a kind of strength I did not know I was watching until it was over. Now let me tell you about the hospital room. It was a Wednesday afternoon. The light through the window was the flat gray of early spring. My father was more alert than he had been in days. There was something in the way he looked at me when I came in that told me he had been saving his strength for this. He said, "I don't want you to be angry at your brother." He said it directly, without preamble, in the tone he used when he wanted to be heard accurately. He said, "I'm not. I'm sad for him. A man who has to take from his own family is a man who never learned how to build what he needs. I don't know where that went wrong for him. Maybe I failed him somewhere, early on, when it could still have been corrected. I've thought about that. But I want you to hear me when I say that it doesn't help anything to carry anger forward. Anger is heavy. It slows you down, and eventually it becomes the thing people remember about you, instead of everything else you are." He paused. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "I see what you did. All those Sundays, all those drives, every time you sat in a waiting room when you could have been somewhere else. I see it. I have always seen it. I want you to know that before I run out of time to say it. I see it, and I am grateful for it, and I love you." I held his hand for a long time after that without saying anything. There was nothing to add. He had said the whole thing. Then he said, "There are some envelopes in the workshop. I need you to make them up and carry them wherever people gather after I am gone. There is a list of names in the bottom drawer. You will know what to do." So I made the envelopes. I sat at my father's workbench on 4 different evenings, his handwritten notes in front of me and the list of names beside them, folding and addressing and sealing each one. I knew what I was making. There were moments in that workshop, in the smell of machine oil and old wood and the absence of my father, when it was very hard to continue. But I continued, because that is what he raised me to do. Now let me take you back to that room. Each envelope contained 2 things. The first was a single photocopied page from the second deed. 1 page. 2 paragraphs. 1 sentence highlighted in yellow: "The property and all assets associated therewith shall not be subject to any transfer, sale, encumbrance, or distribution except as directed by the signatory or their designated heir, whose identity is recorded herein." The designated heir was me. The second was a handwritten note from my father. He had written 52 notes, 1 for each name on his list, in the months before he died. Some were long. Some were a paragraph. Some were only a few lines that managed to say everything. They were written in his slow, deliberate handwriting, the handwriting of a man who understood that what you write down becomes permanent in a way that what you say does not. Mine made me cry the first time I read it, most times since, but mine is mine and I will keep it. When Gerald opened his envelope, he read the photocopy first. Quickly, then again, more slowly. Then the note. I could not see his face from where I stood, but I could see his shoulders, and I watched the change move through them the way a change moves through a body when something it has been holding under pressure for a very long time is finally released. Not explosion. Not collapse. Something quieter. The sound, if silence can have a sound, of a thing that cannot be taken back. Fletcher walked to the front of the room and introduced himself. He stood in his plain blue suit and his reading glasses and explained, in the measured tone of a man who has been doing this for 4 decades, exactly what the second deed meant, what the checks represented legally, what had been done, and what could not be undone. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. Gerald's attorney sat very still. Then he stood and excused himself to make a phone call and did not return. Before anyone could fill the silence, my daughter's oldest child stood up from the front row. She is 14. She watches more than she speaks, sees more than most adults do, and has her great-grandfather's hands and, as it turns out, something of his timing. She said, "Can I read my note out loud?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Then, from the back of the room, someone said yes. And then several people said it, quietly, the way people agree to something they did not expect to be asked, but find, once asked, that they want very much. She read it. I will not tell you what it said. I will only tell you this. My father found a way in a single handwritten page, composed from a hospital bed in the last months of his life, to be more fully himself than most people manage in a lifetime of carefully chosen words. By the time she reached the final sentence, there were grown men in that room with their heads bowed. Not in grief exactly, in something closer to recognition. The recognition of people who have just heard, out loud, something they already knew was true. Nobody cashed Gerald's checks. Not one person. A few set them on the table when they stood to leave. A few tucked them quietly into Gerald's jacket pocket without making eye contact. One man, who had worked in my father's shop for 22 years and had hands almost as scarred and capable as my father's own, held his check out to Gerald and said only, "No thank you, son." Then he walked out. What happened afterward was not dramatic in the way stories are sometimes dramatic. It was simply the truth doing what the truth does when it has been given the proper documents. The forgery was reported by Fletcher, as his professional obligation required. The investigation moved through proper channels over several months. Gerald was required to make restitution. He was required to participate in a legal process that was, for a man of his particular vanity, more devastating than any shouted confrontation could have been, because it was public and recorded and could not be explained away. His name appeared in the county legal notices. People who had known him, people who had taken his checks and his easy charm at face value, read it. The tools that could be recovered were returned. Carl Briggs, who had made the phone call that set everything in motion, was given first right of purchase on the shop when I determined I could not run it myself. He has kept the sign. He refinished it last spring, and the original color, a deep forest green, was right there underneath the years, waiting to be found. The farm is still in the family. My daughter and her husband are there now. They have put in a kitchen garden along the south fence line where my father used to park his truck when he came home from the shop. The light in that part of the property in late afternoon is the color of old brass, warm and low and long. Every time I drive out there, I think about him pulling in off the county road, the engine ticking as it cooled, his boots on the gravel, his hands still carrying whatever he had been building that day. He built something with those hands that no one could take from him, and it is still there. I have not spoken to Gerald since the reception. He tried to reach me in the first year. I did not respond. This is not anger. Anger would require me to still be thinking about Gerald, and I am not, or not much. It is simply that I understand now, perhaps for the first time, that some doors are not closed in bitterness, but in clarity. You can love someone and still understand that the space between you is one you no longer have any reason to cross. Perhaps that will change. I am not a young woman, and I hold nothing absolutely. But for now, the quiet on the other side of that door is its own kind of peace. My father once told me, on a Sunday morning in his kitchen, that the truest thing a person leaves behind is not money or property. It is the record of how they treated the people around them when no one was watching. That record exists whether you write it down or not. It lives in the people who were there. It finds its way back in its own time, by its own route. He said he had believed this his whole life. He was right, and he spent 10 years making certain of it. He filed a deed and wrote 52 letters and waited with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime learning that good work does not rush, and that a thing properly made will outlast every shortcut taken against it. At the end, my father won. Not loudly, not with a speech or a gesture. He won the way he had done everything he was proud of. Quietly, precisely, with patience and craft, with his hands, with the truth, and with a notarized document sitting in a county records office for 10 years, waiting for exactly the right moment to be opened. I miss him every single day. I miss his coffee and his measured voice and the way he held a finished part up to the light to check it. I miss his silences, which always felt like they contained something rather than nothing. I miss driving out on Sunday mornings and knowing he would be there. But I have the workshop. I have the farm. I have his granddaughter reading his words in a room full of people who needed to hear them. That is enough. That is, as my father would say, good work. What would you have done, sitting in that chair, if you had watched your brother hand out checks at your father's funeral, knowing what you knew, carrying what you carried? Tell me in the comments. And please, tell me your age when you answer. This story is for all of us who have been there, or who have someone we love who has, or who are sitting with something heavy right now and wondering whether patience is really enough. It is. I promise you, it is. And if this story found something true in you today, there is another one coming. A story about a grandmother who never raised her voice in her life, a farmhouse, and a buyer who thought he had purchased something that had never been for sale. He did not find this out until the day he arrived to take possession, standing in the driveway with a key that did not fit the lock, holding a deed with a name on it he had never heard. A name about to walk across that gravel and introduce itself in a way nobody standing there was going to forget. That story is next. And justice arrives there the same way it always does, quietly, on its own schedule, with the right piece of paper at exactly the right moment.